Hi, I'm Tom Stephenson and welcome to Tools, Techniques, and Mental Models for Success series. In this series, we are looking at the tools, techniques, and mental models that you can utilize in business, project management, and for success in your personal life. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at reaching goals. This is going to be two parts of the series, and this is part one. And we're going to be looking at specifically SMART goals. What are SMART goals and how do you achieve them, and some examples of that. And really, we call that the 5+2 steps to success. As you'll see, SMART is an acronym that ties to a bunch of letters, S-M-A-R-T, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. But first, we'll just give a quick review. In some of the other videos in the series, we've talked about the management cycle. And from a business management perspective at a high level, we look at planning, organizing, leading, and controlling our business. We can also think of this in the same way in project management, perhaps without the mission aspect, but really that's the project charter in a project management perspective, defining that. And we're going to we've already discussed what a mission is, the purpose, the vision, where we want to go. And if we've got that really well established to be able to achieve it, then we got to go to the next level down and break it down into goals. So at a higher level below the vision, we still really start to get goals, which helps to engage us, to motivate us, to ensure that we're paddling the rowboat in the same direction, so to speak. And we need a process that we can use on an ongoing basis that will be something that we can do intuitively, that we can habitualize and become very successful at implementing it, rather than just sort of going our own way every time and not remembering what the best processes and examples are. So we want to use the process that we're going to develop, and we'll call it today SMART goals, so that we can successfully achieve our goals. So a little bit about the history. There's been a lot of research done going from the 1960s onto the current day. Probably two of the most famous that have done research are Locke and Latham. Done a lot of research on what are the elements to create goals, to motivate people to achieve goals, to have more success in achieving the goals that are laid out. And they really broke it down into 5 areas: clarity, challenge, commitment, feedback, and task complexity. And we're going to go to what we call SMART goals, which really has sort of repackaged that just so that it's a little bit more memorable. None of what they have there is not is missed out in the SMART goal aspect. It's just easier to remember from that perspective. The one that probably is kind of like not clear in the SMART goal perspective is the feedback loop. And the feedback loop is such an important aspect of really being able to see how you're doing and measuring how you're doing and monitoring and making adjustments. As you'll see when we discuss in other episodes, project management, but also business management when you're setting goals, it's not a straight path. It'd be wonderful if it was a straight path, and it's wonderful to have a plan, but there's going to be things that interrupt our flow. So the feedback mechanism allows us to recalibrate and redirect to get ourselves back on track. And indeed, in some cases, in more advanced cases that we'll discuss, sometimes you have to determine this goal no longer makes sense because the world has changed in such a way that this goal no longer makes sense. I think a pandemic 2020 is a good example of that. You know, at the beginning of the year, people had certain goals, businesses had certain goals, and those goals had to go out the window and be redeveloped and changed as a result of the external environment constraints that were being placed on many individuals and businesses and projects. So SMART goals, as I mentioned, is an acronym, S-M-A-R-T, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. So that's really 5 steps, and the other 2 steps that we'll talk about is number 1, a commitment to achieving the goal, and number 2, self-efficacy, which is really referring to confidence. And so when we say specific, as the S mentions, I often think of a movie around the Christmas holidays called Elf stars Will Ferrell, kind of a funny kind of movie in lots of ways. And he's outside this restaurant. It says world's best coffee, and he's all excited. He's an elf from the North Pole, and he's all excited. The world's best coffee, wants to try the world's best coffee, and in his mind he believes it's the world's best coffee. Really, it's just some dive of a restaurant that put a sign that said world's best coffee. And it reminds me of McDonald's about 15 years ago or so. They didn't have that great a coffee, and I think at a certain point they decided, well, we want to have the best, large franchise coffee going. To be honest, a lot of franchises back then didn't have too good a coffee. And they ranked pretty low, and they set a target to actually rank number one. So they were very specific about it. At the time it was for McDonald's Canada. They wanted to, there was a ranking, I think it was in Canadian Business or Maclean's or both. I think they're owned by the same company. And it was a third party testing and surveying, and they came up with the data and determined how the rankings would flow. And so to McDonald's at the time, that meant, well, how do we do? So if we're currently number 9, if we move up to number 6, we're improving. And it's a third party. It's not sort of like them saying, oh yeah, we've got the best coffee. That's too subjective. You want to make things as objective as possible, as you'll see, for the other elements to fall in place. So it has to be really well defined. If you do a project, a construction project, it's pretty specific, and we'll talk about this in our next session. What do we have to accomplish? What are we contracted to do? What are the specifications, the drawings, the contract requirements that we have to fit in? If we get into the details, we can see a lot of specific elements, and we know what we need to do. So it can be very specific, and we break it down into a schedule. We have activities which need to be very specific. We need to understand what each one is. So that's important. If you really don't know what it is you're trying to accomplish, or you don't really know when you'll get there, it's like a business saying we'll be profitable in 5 years. So does that mean you're making $1 profit in a year? Or does it mean you're making 100,000? It's much better if you were specific about it. We are going to make X amount of dollars in profit in 5 years. Doesn't mean if you don't, you failed, but it gives you something to target and to measure as you go along. Or we're going to make so much percentage of sales as profit. These are more specific elements. Measurable. Well, if we made it specific, it becomes easier to measure it. How are we at this stage as we go along? Well, we expected that we would have the 5th best coffee by 1 year from now. And we're currently 8th, so we want to move up the rung. Well, that would be measurable because you gave a time frame, maybe 5 years, for when you expect to be number 1, or 3 years. After 1 year, you expect to have moved from 8th to 5th or to 4th. So that's giving you really a good idea of what you can measure. Same thing goes with projects. When you are developing an overall goal to complete this project on time, well, you want to break it down into a series of activities. And indeed, you could break it down into smaller goals called milestones that then you could measure. How are we on this smaller goal, this milestone? Oh, we're a little bit behind schedule. We're a little bit over budget. You can measure it. So it's got to be measurable, something that's as objective as possible where possible. Some things aren't always that easy to make objective, but generally it can be done pretty well. So you just have to work at that part of it, making it measurable. The specific part helps you that way. And then there's agreed upon and realistic. These two, I find that people get mixed up. They sometimes, when you read about and you can look up SMART goals, there's a lot of theory out there on the web, and there'll be different terms that people will use for the A and the R. Agreed upon, attainable, realistic, resource-based. There's other ones. I think of agreed upon as if you're on a larger project or in a business, you're trying to get things done, so you need other people to do these things. You're holding some accountabilities, and so you're making sure that the other person or the other company that you're working with is agreeing to your terms. So we need to, in a construction project, we need to have the electrical work roughed in this period of time. And this is the work that needs to be done in this period of time. And this is the quality expectation that we need in this period of time. And do you agree to it? Because if the other party that's actually going to do the work doesn't agree to it, what do you think the odds are that you're going to be successful? I'm thinking they're not very good. So agreed upon is looking at the other party and seeing if they agree upon, and also do they believe they can do it. You know, goals need to be challenging, as Locke and Latham said. They need to be challenging. It shouldn't be something that's boring or disinterested. It should be challenging, but it shouldn't be deemed to be impossible, because if it's deemed impossible, then people don't try. So it may be something that you've got to reach for, and is it attainable? And the other party needs to believe that it's possible. If they don't, then you want to find out why, and what are the things you can do to help make it seem attainable to them, to help them believe it. Because maybe there's something that roadblock, or something, you have an employee and they need to get something done, but they need somebody else to do something, and they don't believe that person will do it. Well, if you have a discussion with that other person and make sure it's clear that they need to do it, then you've just removed that roadblock for that other individual. Now all of a sudden they believe it's attainable. So those kind of conversations can be really helpful in ensuring that things are agreed upon and attainable. From a realistic resource base, number 4 is you got to look at it now, looking at the other party, and based on their past history and your experience and looking at their skill sets, is it realistic for them to do this? Because they may have said that, agreed to doing it. They may believe they can do it, or they may not. They may actually believe they can do it, but may not be able to do it. Some people have a little bit too optimistic focus on what they can and they can't do. So if you're dealing with, going back to my electrical subcontractor example, if that electrical subcontractor has kind of let you down a number of times in the past, I'd be a little bit concerned that they're saying they can do it when they haven't got a long track record of actually doing what they say they're going to do. Conversely, if they've had a long track record of doing what they say, I'm going to have a lot more confidence in that. So it helps me to better plan and make sure that I'm not putting all my eggs in that basket, to have some contingencies in place, and also to use Pareto's Law. We'll look at in another video Pareto's Law, but that's the 20-80 rule. An example of that is 20% of your subcontractors take 80% of your time, because it means you're going to have to put more effort into ensuring that they can do it. On the other hand, if it's a subcontractor that's what I would call an A+ subcontractor, you probably don't have to put a lot of effort. You've hired the best. They do what they say they're going to do. You can spread some of that time on some of the C rated subcontractors on your project to ensure they get their components done. So that's the agreed upon, attainable, and the realistic and resource based. And of course, number 5 is very important because it's time based. You need to put a deadline on things. It puts a sense of urgency on your activities. If you can imagine, if I said to this electrical subcontractor, we need the rough ends done. Oh, when? Oh, it doesn't really matter. Well, that electrical subcontractor is not going to send anybody until they're out of work somewhere else. They'll have this little project on the side, and then they can just, when they slow down, they can just send them to your project. So your project has just moved to the bottom of the urgency list. And you can imagine if you have a whole bunch of different players on your project thinking that way, your project is going to be way, way overdue, and it's going to be way, way over budget. So you need to build that sense of urgency in there. You also need to make it not too much time. You know, when you even if you put a time frame, you gotta make sure it's not buffered too much, because if people know that they've got 3 weeks to do a 2-week task, you know what? They kind of take longer, or they don't send enough resources till the last minute, and then something else happens and it actually delays the project. There's actually a term that we'll look at in our tools and techniques series called Parkinson's Law. And it's basically that time will fill whatever you've given it to it. So it'll take somebody as long as whatever time you've given them. If you give somebody 3 weeks to write a report, or you give them 2 weeks to write the report, it's the same report, but you've given them too much time anyway. So when it's 3 weeks, it'll take them 3 weeks. When it's 2 weeks, it'll take them 2 weeks. And if it's 3 weeks, it might actually take them a little bit longer if they get delayed. So you've given too much time for that. Better to have that time later on if they finish it early, or you have a tighter timeline provided for it. So that's time-based. And that's of utmost importance, and time-based really gets into, when we get beyond the planning aspect, the scheduling aspect when we're talking about project management. And the +2, as I mentioned, make you sure that you're able to achieve and have success are commitment. So hire really good qualified people. Pre-qualify your stakeholders that you're working with, your subcontractors. If there's commitment there, then your likelihood of success has gone up a whole set of stairs on your journey up the ladder, if you will. So you need to have commitment, because if people don't care, then that's going to be a problem. And self-efficacy, meaning that you have the confidence that you can do this work. So self-efficacy, you get confidence from having been successful in other projects, from being successful having done other things in your business, from having been successful in your personal life. You know, you got a degree, you got a diploma, you went through college, and you jumped all these different hoops that you had to jump through to get there. That builds confidence over time. And when you've had failures and you've been able to look at those failures and improve upon them the next time round, that starts to build confidence. We all have failures, but building confidence by picking ourselves up, dusting ourselves off, and getting back to work, that's really of significance from that perspective. So that's the sort of the introduction to SMART goals. I wanted to bring into this short video too, big, hairy, audacious goal, BHAG. And Jim Collins came up with that in his book, Good to Great. And it's about companies having a stretch goal. These are big goals that companies have. So again, he's following the sort of the mantra that it can't be something that's just easy. It's got to be something that's a challenge. And if you rally a whole company around a challenge, it can be very engaging. It can be very motivating. It gets that people, I don't work for this company. I'm part of this company, and this is our mission. This is what we're trying to achieve. And so now you see how the connection is being made between this recording and the previous recordings. When we talked about mission, we talked about vision, we talked about core values, then it helps to tie into bringing in a big, hairy, audacious goal of where you want to bring this company. And that's a high level goal, which is then going to require a whole bunch of breakdowns of smaller goals and milestones to get us to that bigger goal. So you don't set a bunch of these, right? These are, one-offs. There's another excellent book that I'll mention in another video, and it's called The One Thing. And so if for a big, hairy, audacious goal, you want to have that as your one thing. This is what's driving this business. This is where we're going. Get on the bus or get on the train because it's leaving. Whether you're getting on or not, this is where we're going. And as I mentioned with mission, it tied to Kennedy's pronouncement of getting a man to the moon this decade and returning him this decade. And so a very defined time frame, very clear, very specific of what was to be done. And that's very helpful when you have that kind of clarity and drive at a higher level. It's interesting. It's hard to get people motivated as something that's mundane, although we do have to do those things. But if we're going to have a BHAG, a driver kind of goal, that's where big, hairy, audacious goal comes in. On a personal level, it can be as well. I'm going to do an MBA, and I'm going to do it by this time period, and this is essentially what I'm going to have to do. I believe it's attainable. I believe it's realistic, and all of those elements, and putting it and breaking it down into how I'm going to accomplish that. So that can be a big, hairy, audacious goal. Now, while we're on goals, and this being part one, I thought I'd finish with just giving a little bit of a breakdown too, is that, as much as I'm waving the goals flag, which I am a big fan of, I also want to say that goals are not always great if you set the wrong goals, or they're not clarified enough, or if they are too motivating for some people. So you have to be careful, especially a lot of companies, they set goals for their employees, and then they put reward systems against them. bonus incentives. We call those extrinsic rewards, and we want to drive our employees to achieve these goals, which is good. In the short term, it can really have a motivating effect for employees. But if they're too driven towards achieving the goal, then maybe they're going to achieve it at the expense of something else. So for one example, I would say is the 2008 financial crisis. There was a lot of goals that were given by banks to their employees to get mortgages and get more mortgages and get them signed off and make sure that they're signed off. And the more mortgages, the better. And they're supposed to meet this criteria to ensure that the mortgages are safe. But then later on, they found that pretty much if you had a pulse, you were going to get a mortgage because this bank employee would get a bonus, their boss would get a bonus. And so at a certain point, it put the whole world economy in jeopardy because it was kind of a house of cards that was built on these incentives, which were the criteria was being very, very loosely followed. I believe there a few years ago too, there was a few banks that got into a lot of trouble where they offered bonuses to their employees to open new checking accounts. And then there was a lot of pressure that if they didn't do that, whether they would keep their jobs. That means that people may do unscrupulous things. On a personal level, I know of a home builder, a very large home builder, that for a short period of time put incentives, we'll have no late closings. That sounds like a good idea. No late closings. You'll have happier clients because the houses will close on time. Bonuses tied to no late closings. So you got site supers and project managers. They like to get their bonus. You know what? There was no late closings or very few late closings. You know what happened? The warranty issues went through the roof. So they cut corners to get occupancy, and then people moved in, and there were all of these problems with quality, and then they had to be rectified. So the advantage of having no late closings kind of went out the window. You had unhappy homeowners who had a lot of flaws in their houses that the builder had to go back and fix. They were a very good builder. They went back and fixed it, but it kind of caused a bit of problems. Even worse was the warranty department, which was a separate department, took care of all the problems after the house closed. So the people that actually managed the closing of the house didn't even have to deal with them. So really it wasn't their problem. No moral hazard, as they said in the banking sector, for the problems. When you create problems and you personally don't have to deal with the problems, there's no moral hazard there for you. So I might as well take a chance. My risk has been lowered. So those kind of things occur, right? And so we have to think about our goals, and we have to ensure that we've thought them through, and we've looked at different possible outcomes. If we had a more balanced approach, so that perhaps we had a warranty follow-up before the bonuses were assigned, that these houses had to be so few warranty issues before the bonus would be issued, or some sort of clawback program if there were a lot of excessive warranty issues, then that would be very, very helpful from that perspective. So you got to be careful how you design it. Extrinsic rewards, that's for another day. Extrinsic versus intrinsic rewards. We can look and talk about that. Obviously, in the business world, extrinsic rewards are very well known and utilized, but we'll also talk about intrinsic rewards at some point and see how that works too, with helping people to achieve the goals of the business, because they can be a very powerful tool as well. So that gives you an overview of SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable. That's the hard one to understand, right? The stakeholder, the subcontractor, your employee, they agree that they can do this. They feel they can accomplish it. Realistic, you feel that they can do it based on past history, or you don't, because then that would allow you to have some contingencies in place, making sure that it's time bound so that you can achieve that within the time frame that's given. So it creates that sense of urgency. Has to be realistic, shouldn't be deemed to be impossible, should be a stretch. Commitment, you believe that you can do it yourself from a high level. You've hired committed people. Committed contractors. We can get into discussion on lowest price. Maybe lowest price isn't the best way to go in certain cases. If they're all pre-qualified though, and they've got a good history, that's a different story. Time commitment and commitment and self-efficacy, confidence. And as you implement these kind of systems and you think about them, and over your lifespan, you'll see that that builds a lot of confidence in your ability, and you start to believe that you can do it, and you start to build in a process. And we'll talk about that in another one of our videos, which will be goals and systems, or goals versus systems. Some people have written about goals not being very good for a variety of reasons, like the one I just mentioned, and process is where it's at. Myself, I'm a fan of the integration of both of them. You have them feed off each other, integrate with each other, and work with each other. But I am in agreement from on the personal level, on the happiness level, you got to enjoy the journey. It's not all about the goal at the end. You got to enjoy the process. You got to enjoy the journey. Again, these are things to think about in our own journeys. So I'm Tom Stephenson. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'll be loading more videos. I tend to do it at least weekly and often bi-weekly, new videos as we go along, and build our community here and elsewhere, and we will go forward. That's one of my goals. So I look forward to seeing you soon, and have a wonderful day. Bye for now.